And we're at 2:45. So our moderator this session, Ian Nelson from the Pacific Crest Trail. Ian, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Randy. Hi, folks. Happy to moderate this next session with Anna Zawisza of the Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado, and Dan Williams, also with Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado. Just going to tell you a little bit about them before I pass it off. But Anna is the Chief Program Officer for the Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado. She directs VOC's programmatic delivery, develops strategic partnerships, oversees marketing communications, solicits funding, and provides overall leadership and vision to her areas of responsibility. Anna's passion for environmental stewardship, ability to build rapport with people of all backgrounds, and commitment to VOC's mission helps the organization reach annual and strategic goals. Anna has been volunteering with VOC since 2007 and is a certified crew leader. Prior to joining VOC in October 2015, Anna spent 7 years working at the Alliance for Sustainable Colorado, the last 2 as executive director. And Dan is VOC's Associate Director of Programs. Dan provides leadership for VOC's program team and develops partnerships with government agencies and non-governmental groups to support VOC programs. Dan oversees and coordinates the Outdoor Stewardship Institute training program and other volunteer capacity building efforts. Dan brings over a decade of experience in planning and managing a variety of outdoor stewardship efforts and programs. He works closely with VOC colleagues and numerous partner groups and land managers around Colorado and the US to develop, plan, and manage VOC's annual trainings, projects, and other programmatic efforts. So with that, I will pass it off to Anna and Dan.
All right, thank you, Ian. We'll go ahead and fire up the old screen share here. Just give me a moment. Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for sitting in on this session with us, and the group that has been planning this workshop, for inviting Anna and myself to come give this presentation. Again, I'm Dan Williams with Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado. And I was sitting in on the session on Monday, listening in, and in the presentations, some of the great presentations that other groups provided, was pleased to hear a lot about the connection between wilderness advocacy and volunteer stewardship, and how the powerful community engagement and accomplishment you can gain from volunteer stewardship can really be a powerful tool in your toolbox in regards to advocating for wilderness, just generally speaking. And so that's really what we're going to dive into here today, take a deep dive into sustainable and strong volunteer programs. And specifically, we really want to offer that by thinking through and thinking about your volunteer programs through a set of best practices in a variety of topics, you can really strengthen and enhance your impact both in terms of what you're getting done in the wilderness areas that you steward, and in the reach you have for community members, both in terms of who and how many volunteers you're engaging. And so, through that lens, we'll give everybody a little bit of background context in who we are and what we're doing to help steward wilderness here in Colorado. We'll talk through kind of best practices and ideas in a variety of different topics, including stating your case for volunteerism, using data effectively to support programs, effective project selection and development, volunteer recruitment and retention. That's one that we tend to get a lot of inquiries on. How do we do a better job of recruiting volunteers and keeping them around once they're recruited? I'll go through kind of how a lot of that has come together for us in a few different wilderness project examples that we've put out there in the last few years. I'll share some different resources you can access to review and find even more about this information and a whole host of topics related to volunteer program management. And then, of course, we'll wrap up with some time for some Q&A. So just briefly about us, Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado is a nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado, and we also have some staff working in offices embedded with our agency partners in the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado and in Greeley, Colorado, in northeastern part of the state. We were founded in 1984 with the mission of enabling and engaging people in Colorado as active stewards of the state's natural resources. And since that time, we've engaged folks, over 126,000 volunteers now, and 13 plus projects serving public lands, trails, parks, open space, wilderness areas, doing all sorts of different projects, and donating a donated labor value of over $25 million. And currently we're looking at around 100 projects a year across all of our programs, across all the volunteers that we engage. So really we're running hard every year through April and October, when the warmer weather seasons allow us here in Colorado to get out and get people going on the ground. And in addition to our volunteer projects, we also manage a training program, our Outdoor Stewardship Institute training program, where we train about 300 people every year in Colorado and elsewhere in the country from time to time, depending on the partnerships that we've engaged in and who we're working with, but with focuses on volunteer crew leadership, specifically around the disciplines of trails and also ecological restoration, and buckets in the various types of tasks where we have expertise and where we do work. We're a cooperator with the Forest Service, providing saw training, both in crosscut and chainsaw certification. We teach a variety of different stewardship skills, from some of the hard skills around trails and restoration to other types of soft skills like volunteer project management. We're starting to put together trainings around diversity and equity and inclusion in volunteer programming, and much, much more. So there's a lot that we do in training and capacity building, some of which I'll actually come back to a little bit later in this presentation, but broadly speaking, that's sort of the outline of that program. And I thought it would be a good idea for us to, just for the purposes of this workshop, give a little context about where specifically we are doing our work in wilderness stewardship in Colorado. We're certainly lucky here in Colorado to have a large number of different wilderness areas, so a lot of great places that have been protected as wilderness. Our largest single partner is the U.S. Forest Service, and so that does open us up to a lot of different wilderness stewardship. Bear with me for a minute, I'm going to be working off some notes here. But in 2021 alone, we've engaged 316 volunteers who've donated over 6,000 hours of their time in wilderness stewardship as just a portion of our programs. And one of the main areas where we're working right now is in the Mount Evans and Lost Creek wilderness areas. They're managed as a single unit by a couple districts of the Arapahoe and the Pike National Forests. And as you can see from this top picture, what you're looking at there, looking west from downtown Denver, largely what you can see is a big portion of the eastern half of the Mount Evans wilderness. And so given their proximity to Colorado's largest population centers in Denver and also in Colorado Springs, these two wilderness areas see quite a bit of impact in terms of recreational use and other visitation. And so there's a large need, and certainly in Colorado, just in general, we have a high level of recreational use and other visitation across all of our public lands, and so that drives a lot of need. But specifically for us, with this being in our backyard, we have some great partnerships with both the land managers and the local Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness Friends Group. We do quite a bit of stewardship work year in and year out in these two areas. We're also quite active on the Rio Grande National Forest, where we have an employee embedded in the forest office as a volunteer coordinator, and in the La Garita, Wemanouche, South San Juan, and Sangre de Cristo wilderness areas, where we do a lot of different work pretty much every year. And we've been pretty excited in the last few years to have developed a partnership working in the Flat Tops Wilderness with the White River National Forest. This is particularly special for us because, as many of you probably know, this was an early milestone at the beginning of the 20th century for the initial inception of wilderness as a concept in general, and became designated by the Forest Service at that time. It wasn't called wilderness then, but the designation it was given as a special preservation area essentially became what what wilderness is now. And so, we're lucky to have that legacy and heritage in Colorado, and VOC's been able to participate in stewardship in that area as well. And those aren't the only areas we work. Just in an annual basis, we'll tack on some of these other wilderness areas as part of our annual work. But in recent years, this has been general, kind of the major areas where our focus has been. And we are a statewide organization. We work all over Colorado in a given year.
So now that you know a little bit about VOC, where we wanted to start really talking about how to build out sustainable volunteer programs are some of the things to consider when making your case for volunteerism. And so it's imperative that as you come to the table and you think about doing on-the-ground volunteer projects in wilderness areas, that you have viable partners and partners who are really engaged in and support the work that you are proposing to do. And so a couple of things to consider as you look both kind of from the programmatic side of things. So who needs to be there to help out with the actual project development, to then seeking funding for that project. And I know that's top of mind for many of us. We'll talk a little bit about how to state your case for recruitment of volunteers, but at this point, let's just kind of think about partners and funders. So first, I think it's just really important to know that every community is going to be different, and every community is going to have challenges, opportunities, gaps. So anything that you can do to kind of make it really relevant to the specific needs of the community where you will be working, or near the communities where you will be working, will help you in making your case. Other stakeholders that are engaged in the process are really important also to kind of monitor and engage. So things like, if there are meetings about the work that needs to be held, to be attending those, to be reading master plans, to be providing input on those so that your voice is always at the table. I think sometimes what we've learned in our 37 years of working with volunteers is that sometimes volunteers are a little bit of an afterthought. And so coming to the table really early and making sure that how the work gets done, and making sure that, that case is stated for volunteer engagement from the start is really important. Another really big driver is economic conditions. So there's lots and lots of information right now, especially from that Outdoor Industry Association, about the outdoor rec economy and tourism. So bringing that voice in, and then finally, to really think about what potential funders are seeking. So understanding, what foundations may be interested, what corporate sponsors might want to do with you, and making that case from the start. Next slide, Dan. We wanted to provide an example of kind of what VOC's case for volunteer stewardship looks like. And this is a little bit different than I think what your case might be, simply because, as Dan said, we don't just work in wilderness areas. So this is kind of across the board. But things that we've really found to be successful is this idea of kind of deepening the connection between people and nature. We talk about the education that we do on our projects, the hands-on investment that volunteers make in the work, the ability to take care of places that people visit and recreate. So just kind of deepening that connection and making it an important lifelong commitment. I already mentioned the recreation economy in Colorado. That's a huge driver. And I think a lot of people really understand that, but having good metrics around jobs, economic development, trail access and what that does to a local economy is critical. Another case for us that's recently come up is something that we're putting out there. It's a focus on community resiliency, especially when it comes to natural disasters, such as wildfires. We do a lot of kind of fuels management work that allows a community to have more resiliency if a wildfire breaks out, but then also post-disaster work. Another area where, again, we're kind of finding, and maybe this isn't as applicable to this audience, but I think it's just important for you to consider your own communities and things that might resonate. But for us, being urban-based as well, this idea of the intersection between human and environmental health in our urban centers is really resonating right now. Climate change, both on the mitigation and adaptation side, is really important to partners and funders. And finally, the idea of environmental justice, looking at kind of the policies that were put in place over the last many decades that may have led to inequities and some things that can be done with volunteers to correct those inequalities. So that's our case. We do a lot of work with other partners. Dan will talk a little bit about our toolkit work. We can help you shape your own case through kind of some other programmatic efforts down the road.
Thanks, Anna. And I was just thinking about, you had mentioned that intersection of human and environmental health. I did hear in some of the conversation earlier this week, folks pointing out when kind of advocating for wilderness stewardship as an example that these spaces, preserving these spaces can help preserve ecosystem services like water quality and things of that nature. And so I think there's absolutely an intersection there. And then, for us taking that one step further, okay, how are volunteers going to help make that possible? So we'll point that out as well. So this next item we want to talk about in some thoughts around best practices and what you can do to support and sustain your volunteer programs is how you're using data. And I think all of us that work with volunteers and manage volunteer projects and staff-driven projects as well, are tracking data around hours and accomplishments. And if you're not, you absolutely should be. But beyond just that straight up accomplishment information, if you're tracking data over long periods of time, you're thinking creatively about how you're using it, and you're analyzing it to kind of inform yourself about what it might be telling you about your programs, it can be a really powerful tool in guiding program development and program strategy. And so just some specific examples. Certainly, we have a long history and a long range of data going back many years about just how many volunteers we're putting out on the ground and what that's accomplishing. And so if we're holding on to that data over a long period of time, it can really help us in actually scoping new volunteer projects and communicating with our partners. Okay, well, this is what you want to get done, or this is what we can expect to get done with this size of group in this sort of context. And that's, again, a big question that I get a lot is, well, how do you know how much work a volunteer group can get done? And certainly, if you're just getting started, it can be a little bit, it might be a little bit trickier beyond just, personal experience and expertise. But if you're collecting this over time, then that is going to give you a really powerful resource to just go back and say, well, here's what we've done with that sort of size group or with that type of work in the past and what it's going to take to make that happen with volunteers. Another really good example that's informed our volunteer recruitment and retention strategy is we took a look a few years ago at what does participation in a given season of volunteer work, level of participation, what might that tell us about an individual's ongoing participation? And so we looked at, how many times did a person come out in one year, and then how many subsequent years did they volunteer after that season? And what we found was that if an individual attended 3 projects as a volunteer, that was a really powerful predictor of them then attending in many years beyond, up to 5 more years of involvement, more likely to become a crew leader or another type of volunteer leader, more likely to become a donor, these types of things. And so what that's crystallized for us is various strategies around trying to get people to 3 projects in a season in their first season with VOC. And so things like making sure we're acknowledging in various ways, either on project or in newsletters, say, hey, so-and-so reached their third project, hooray, congratulations. Making sure that these individuals are getting tagged as potential prospects for leadership development or becoming donors, things of that nature. Making sure they're getting invited to our year-end recognition events if they have attended this many projects. So really trying to focus on this as a really critical number. And that was, we determined we were going to do that all from our analysis of our participation data over a number of years. Another element that came out of that, we identified that it was critical that a volunteer who receives some sort of training, say as a crew leader, or we deploy crew chefs to help feed our volunteers on the ground when we have projects, things of that nature. If they receive that training, it's really important that they volunteer in that role at least once that year, or we're going to lose them as participants going forward. And that may sound a little bit obvious, I guess, but to me, it also reinforced for us, the need for follow-up. We can't just train people and then kind of forget about them. We've got to be following up with them. We've got to ask them, hey, are you signed up? Have you been able to get out? Is there any barrier that is precluding you from participating in this role that you've trained in? So really driving home the need for that communication and follow-up when we're making that sort of investment in volunteers. And then finally, quantitative data is really important, but so is qualitative data that can call attention to any number of items that might not be illuminated by numbers. And so for us, where that shows up is really in a lot of post-project surveys. Every time we put out a specific volunteer event or a volunteer training or any other type of volunteer event, we're trying to capture qualitative data both in immediate post-project feedback surveys and also in semi-annual, I believe, Anna, correct me if I'm wrong, but semi-annual impact surveys that capture some slightly different data from kind of everybody who's participated that year. And this calls to our attention any number of things, especially in the post-project surveys where we're kind of leaving open-ended room for the volunteers to tell us their story. It can tell us that maybe we've got a crew leader behaving badly and we need to work with that person to do a better job to make other volunteers feel welcome. Leaving room for storytelling can also get us testimonials that can be helpful for recruitment or can be helpful for storytelling in any number of contexts, including fundraising, where if we tell at the bottom of that survey, ask the volunteer, leave us your name if you're willing for us to use your comments. And then that's a vehicle for us to help, again, state our case, tell our story. And that's not just us telling our story, but our volunteers given that space to tell VOC's story. So just a lot of powerful things that you can do with data. And, it's kind of the sky's the limit, left up to you or your organization's own creativity or ingenuity in terms of how you utilize it. And so collecting it as much as you can and efficiently keeping track of it is really a powerful best practice to use. And anything else you might want to add on that? Am I missing anything? Okay. So the next element that we're going to go into is kind of thinking about selecting good volunteer projects from a number of different perspectives. And so where I'll start with that is that there's a common misconception out there, and I don't know, it's getting less and less common, and I suspect with most folks in this group, this probably isn't the case, but the misconception that we kind of start with is that, volunteer projects is something easy and something free. And what I mean by that, setting up and planning for volunteer projects is easy and free. And, the truth is, I'm sure as we're all well aware, is that designing volunteer jobs that are both rewarding for volunteers and productive for both government agencies and non-governmental partnerships takes a lot of work and planning and requires kind of a balance between volunteer experience and reward and productivity for the project sponsor that must be achieved. And that's a lot of upfront work. And so to kind of put people in a frame of work, a frame of mind and to get at what I'm talking about, I've thrown out, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What do humans need in their lives to be happy? and feel like they have a rewarding life. I've kind of condensed in my thinking around a volunteer's hierarchy of needs. And specifically that, volunteers, they need safety on the work that they're doing. They need to have a positive experience. And then finally, they need to be productive. And these aren't mutually exclusive. This is a balance you're trying to strike, I think, as much as possible, so that when you plan a volunteer project, all of these elements are present. And I think safety, goes without saying, providing the right tools, providing personal protective equipment, ensuring that folks engaged on the ground have appropriate training. But in the experience side of things, it's important that volunteers understand what the bigger picture is, why the work they're doing is important. That's really a fundamental element for us, that when an individual is even considering signing up for a project with us, say via our website, they're hit with that pretty much right up front. Why the work you're doing matters, and what the purpose is. People are going to get a lot out of understanding that. And coupled with that, volunteers like their time to be well used. They want to understand their job description or role, and they like that feeling of accomplishment. And I think that all of this kind of points towards a well-organized and a well-planned project being very critical. You don't want to just kind of throw the volunteers out there and we'll figure it out. You want to take time to provide as much organization and planning as you can, because if you've done a lot of that work on the front end, once you get the volunteers in the door, they're going to have a lot better experience. They're going to be more productive. And most importantly, they're going to want to come back. And some other elements, I can't stress enough the importance of offering free meals and drinks on projects. It sounds simple, but it's definitely a fixture of the way that VOC does projects. I heard it mentioned in, again, conversation earlier when someone was talking about project examples, how they gave everybody a free lunch. And, when you ask someone about their volunteer experience with VOC, one of the first things we're likely to hear is, oh, it was great. They gave me free food and some beer too, and the project was over. So, refreshments are are kind of a critical element of the experience that I'll throw out there, and something that we definitely pay a lot of attention to. And volunteers, it's really important that they're thanked and appreciated. There's a number of different ways that we try to show our appreciation to volunteers to help provide that positive experience. Anything from, giveaways and raffles and that sort of thing, down to just when we train our crew leaders, we train them that it's on you, and it's very important that you need to be there telling everybody what a great job they're doing, thanking them for being there on the project, inviting them to come back, and really getting the whole sort of VOC team from staff and volunteers that are part of execution of projects to, have fun as one of our top priorities, and making sure that we're kind of building a community where everybody feels engaged and welcome and like their time is appreciated and that we want them to be there. So again, these are things that might go without saying, but if you're not thinking about them specifically and kind of incorporating these concepts in as part of your overall program strategy, then you're running more of a risk of having them go by the wayside, especially if you have a lot of people that are engaged kind of on a regular basis, get to know each other over a long period of time. It can become harder to then get new people in the door if they're not thoughtful about being welcoming and appreciative with new volunteers when they have that opportunity. So some other thoughts when kind of selecting good volunteer projects. I've got a long list of things I kind of wanted to go over. Anna mentioned this right off the top, this first element. And I think, again, a lot of us are thinking about this quite a bit. How can you leverage partners in project development? Our perspective, is a few different things. One, certainly as a non-governmental organization, we have to make sure that land agency participation and prioritization is present, by which I mean, we want to make sure that what we're doing is approved, not just approved, but also prioritized by our land management partners, that we're meeting an important need for them. We try not to just kind of do whatever. We want to coordinate with our partners to understand, well, what are your biggest needs? where can we plug in to fill gaps and bring volunteers to help kind of move the needle in terms of stewardship. And we also want to kind of understand with our partners, what are we not doing that you might need help with? And maybe there's somewhere we can plug in that can help get that task going. And when we get to project examples a little further down in the presentation, I'll talk a little more specifically about what I mean by that. But again, just taking the time to be at the table with our partners to really understand kind of holistic needs. Where are we plugging in currently? Where might we have some gaps that we can help fill? That sort of thing. It's also really important to think about how you're engaging with community groups and partner groups, both in stewardship prioritization, and by that I mean, for instance, earlier off the top, I mentioned that we work a lot with the Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness here in Colorado to help kind of understand what's going on in those wilderness areas and where we can best plug in. They have a lot more of the local on the ground eyes and expertise in terms of what they want to prioritize and where volunteers might be needed. So, VOC is not trying to just come in and say, all right, we're here to do this, this, and this, and thank you, don't talk to us about anything else, but really trying to rely upon the expertise of our partner organizations to help us prioritize work and understand what else can be done. And again, I'll kind of come back to that in our project examples. But this is also important in terms of engaging volunteers and recruiting volunteers, and especially for us when we're trying to open our programs up to more different and potentially underserved populations. And so by way of example, we're currently working with a group in the Denver metro area that it has a mission of getting minority populations engaged in the outdoors from Denver. And one of the big things with any partnership development, and this is very specifically stated by this group, is we don't just want them to kind of come in and ride along with what we're doing. We don't just want to come to them and say, we want you to participate, here's what you can do for us. It's much more of an open dialogue and understanding what are your priorities, what are our priorities, how do you want to engage with the outdoors, what's our mission, and where does everything mesh together. And what's been interesting for us in developing this partnership with this group is that they're really interested in not just kind of tagging along with what VOC is doing. They want to take their own ownership of stewardship and really be in charge of what they're doing and have ownership and control over how they're engaging volunteers. And so our role then moves more towards kind of a convener, getting them to the table with our partners, by way of example, some of our Forest Service partners where we think wilderness stewardship might actually play a role for this group, providing them with the resources, training, and capacity that they need to get out there and make a difference. And just kind of, take more of a role of a facilitator. What do you need? What pace do you want to work at? How do you want to be engaged? And how can we provide that for you? So we're not working with all of our partners in volunteer recruitment like this, but I think it's just a good example of how, approaching partnership development for recruitment as an open dialogue has really changed our perspective and what we're doing and what we're providing. And we're really excited for some positive outcomes in getting new and diverse audiences engaged in the outdoors and potentially in wilderness areas here near the Denver metro area. So these second two items kind of hopefully go without saying. You need a budget, and you shouldn't be trying to recruit volunteers until the project is shovel ready. We hope that some of that, stating information around stating your case and storytelling can help you kind of get your message in front of the folks that are potentially helping to provide that budget and being successful there. And again, towards the end of this presentation, we'll kind of go over that more, including driving folks towards some resources that can potentially help develop that. Another thing we want to consider is in any project is physical and technical capability of our volunteer group and the physical and technical needs of that project. Now, I want to point out that this is not to necessarily preclude anything. It's just we want to make sure we understand what these things are so that we're communicating them effectively to our volunteer group. And at least for VOC, we, with very little exception, maybe in projects where a SAW certification is needed, but there's still room for participation in those of uncertified volunteers. We're trying really, really hard to never exclude anyone based on technical acumen alone. We really feel like if we're training our crew leaders well, if we're organizing our projects effectively, then we're able to teach volunteers and guide volunteers what they need to know, no matter what level of skill and experience they bring to our project. So skill and experience level is hardly ever a prerequisite to any of our projects, with the exception of maybe if you're running a SAW or some other tool that actually, you know, requires a certification to be on project. And so that means that volunteer training, leadership in place to manage a project is really important for us. So making sure that across multiple levels of our project management, we've got volunteers in place as crew leaders, as other project planning team members, you know, helping with technical design or overall project leadership, making sure we have that in place through a pretty robust training program, that we've had a curriculum that's been developed over many, many years, that's available for use by other groups. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. But, you know, our staff will we have a full-time staff of 12, 13 folks, plus or minus some seasonals and interns. You know, about 6 or 7 of those folks will see a project as a regular part of their employment, and only one at a time. And so we're really relying on volunteer leadership to drive this bus. And so that's a really important part of our programming, is having solid volunteer leadership in place. And so then, with all this in mind, the only thing that would potentially preclude participation in a given project from a volunteer is the physical difficulty level. You know, how much physical labor demand are we expecting? How far is the hike? We're trying to communicate that to folks all up front, and then let them self-select based on that information. And then we're trying to put out, as for our purposes, trying to engage a broad variety of volunteers and make our work as welcoming as possible. We're trying to put out a variety of different projects that hit at different physical difficulty levels, so that there's a number of different opportunities and different ways in to our organization, so that those barriers for participation are as low as possible. Bear with me just a sec. So another thing to consider, you know, what is the level of risk that goes along with this? Can it be done safely by volunteers? Again, maybe there's some specialized training. Or there are some projects where, you know, we're just looking at it and saying, yeah, that might be better done by a contracted crew, or, you know, we don't have in the time frames that we work in enough time to train folks up to manage that level of risk with that particular project. For instance, we're not doing a lot of machine-based work, that sort of stuff. So again, it's different for different groups, but asking yourself what's an appropriate level of risk that you want to mitigate and manage, and what can be safely done by volunteers is important. And I got that out of order, my apologies. And then is the project interesting and meaningful? And I think this question, is the project interesting and meaningful? It doesn't have one answer. You know, multiple tasks can be made meaningful and interesting if planned and messaged successfully. So generally what we're trying to do is think from a volunteer perspective. Why would you want to participate on this project? Is this type of work exciting? Is it in a compelling place to visit? You know, if the answer to those last 2 questions is, I don't know, but the work is still critical, I can, you know, throw out the example of noxious weed removal in that one. You know, sometimes that's not a super exciting project to do, to go out and clip weed heads or otherwise kind of do very repetitive tasks over and over again, but we can successfully communicate to volunteers why it's critical to do, and that will create buy-in, and we see success in recruitment for that type of project. And then maybe there's some special amenities that we can also use to attract volunteers to projects. For instance, okay, we're going to spend, you know, this portion of the day doing this noxious weed removal project, and then we'll have some sort of educational talk or campfire talk, or, you know, whatever, something additional we can tack onto this that's going to make this a cool and fulfilling and fun event to participate in. But in, you know, thinking back, you know, Is it a project that you would want to participate in? Is it exciting or compelling work? Is the work critical? Is there any other special amenity that can be tacked on? You know, how would you attract volunteers to the project? If you're having trouble satisfactorily answering most of these questions, then you might think twice about what you're planning to do and or how you're asking volunteers to participate. Another thing to think about is kind of what timeframes are you working within? And can the project be completed within the time frame by the volunteer group that you're engaging, or can you get something meaningful done within that time frame? So for instance, you know, VOC, we have kind of a handful of timeframes that we commit to. We're either doing something on a single day basis, we're hanging out for a full weekend, or in the case of some of our wilderness projects, we're hitched out for a full week with volunteers. And each one of those scenarios colors our recruitment a little bit differently in terms of who we're trying to reach and what we're trying to talk to them about. There are some projects where we might turn down because of the way that our kind of reach and our scope is statewide. We're doing a lot of different things within those isolated timeframes, but that might mean that it's something that it's better suited for a local group that can kind of commit more regular attention to a given project, can come in, you know, a few evenings a week, or, you know, over and over again to one project over a long period of time. Maybe that's more appropriate for a group that has that as the time frame that they're working within. And then, you know, if you're asked to take on a specific project, you might need to weigh that against how much is that time frame going to take you away from other things you might want to get done. So again, just a lot of different considerations here. Definitely happy to unpack all that and more in the Q&A. But I'm going to take a break for a little bit here and turn it over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit more about effective volunteer recruitment.
All right, thanks, Dan. So you've got your project, you've got partners, you've got funding, you've got volunteer leaders. Now comes the part about getting volunteers. And there are a few things that we really want to stress in this next portion. And the first is we talk about this in terms of kind of the 3 R's of volunteer management. So I will cover all 3: recruitment, retention, and recognition. And before you even start thinking about recruiting volunteers, it's really important to have kind of 2 sides of that coin fleshed out. So one is kind of the complete detailed picture of the entire project. So Dan talked a little bit about this, but you want to give people an idea of the location. Who are the users? How many users are there? Is there a specific feature of the area that is really appealing potentially for them to go and see that would entice them to come out? You also want to let them know what they will be doing. How strenuous is it? Is there a hike in, as Dan mentioned? Will they need to carry tools with them, or will tools be stashed? We use the ski symbols, so green, a circle, blue square, and black diamond to, you know, in Colorado, most people kind of know what that language is, in order to give people the ability to self-select. And then we have additional information on our website about the physical requirements that we need people to have in order to participate in the project. And then it's really important for volunteers to know why their work matters. And so at least having a couple of sentences about what the volunteer work will accomplish and why is it important to the land, to wildlife, to the land manager, anything that will give people a sense of, wow, you know what, my time is valuable and I'm giving it to this because there's going to be a big impact. Where we really see volunteer groups struggling is that's where they leave off. They talk about the work and the impact, but then they forget the really important part of recruitment, which is what's in it for the volunteer? Why should they come out with you? We call that the value proposition. And so on the next slide, we have some examples. This can be kind of a multi-pronged approach. You could pick a few of these to promote at one time, but generally speaking, we ask people in our post-project surveys why they came out with us. So this isn't a list that we just came up with. we used our volunteers' feedback to us to build out this list, and we're continuing to build it out because there are many reasons that people choose to do volunteer work in the outdoors. And what we want to do is talk to them about the reasons and spell out the reasons that they would want to come out with us. So some things that are really critical to our community are things like, being active outside, discovering new places, learning new skills. But this list will give you a start of what are some of the with them's, what's in it for them, reasons to use in recruitment. On the next slide, I'd like to focus a little bit on marketing efforts. I know that many of us here in this workshop probably don't think about marketing quite as much as probably would help to recruit volunteers. And so finding someone, whether that's a volunteer, a board member, if you have a paid staff, somebody who can do a little bit more of that marketing lift is really critical. Because what we really want to do is do what's called having a target audience and kind of segmenting the audience based upon the particular types of volunteers that you might want. What Dan and I have heard through our years of kind of talking to groups like this is that people generally want younger volunteers and they want more diverse volunteers. And so figuring out who is your target audience and actually going through an exercise of, and generally speaking, you are going to have to kind of generalize about folks, but what do they like to do in their spare time? Where do they live? What news do they listen to? How do they get their news? Younger people are going to have very different answers for that than kind of, Gen X or baby boomers. What are their interests and hobbies? And the reason you do that kind of specific target audience segmentation is then you are able to develop messaging that actually reaches them and use the channels that will get your message in front of them. So while you may have a newsletter or a website or social media yourself that you can put a more generalized message for volunteer recruitment, once you have your specific target audience defined and a message that's compelling to that audience, you will place that message in different places using partners, asking them to spread the word, maybe putting something in a local newspaper, on other websites. And that way you will reach kind of the audience that you are particularly interested in reaching. So having kind of that created and then being able to execute that strategy is really important in not just getting somebody to show up, but getting the type of volunteer that you want on your project to show up. So with that, let's move to kind of the next slide here and talk a little bit about recognizing people. So we all know that there are opportunity costs to volunteering. There's a reason that people will give up their entire day, their entire weekend, maybe a week of their time to come out, and they could be doing lots of different things during that time. And so a very important part of making volunteers feel valued and that way driving volunteer retention is recognizing their efforts. And you kind of have two main ways to do that that we found. Maybe there's others, but the ways that we talk about is communicating the impact of the work and then showing appreciation for the work. So the before and after shot of the turnpike there, that's communicating impact. That's letting people know, wow, look at what 40 volunteers accomplished in the span of 6 hours or whatever it was, or a weekend. Kind of giving people an idea of a sense of accomplishment to the work that was done. Showing appreciation would be more along the lines of thank you to these particular volunteers who actually were on that turnpike during the project, giving them a round of applause at the end of the project, doing shout outs on social media, specifically naming them. So that's kind of more of that showing appreciation for them, maybe giving them swag or doing a raffle. So those are just some of the different ways that you can show appreciation. And then we talk about kind of your 4 main opportunities that you have to either communicate impact or show appreciation. So before the project, talking about kind of the activities that will be done. So you're already kind of planting the seed of why the work matters. And then any perks or benefits of them coming out with you. You know, that might be, as Dan mentioned, food goes a long way, but maybe there's a recreation component to your project. Maybe there will be a campfire talk by somebody to talk about wildlife habitat in the area, or, you know, stargazing, whatever it might be, s'mores. I mean, you know, it's up to you to create that volunteer experience, but talking about it ahead of time to make people understand that, you know, this is an experience that they're really participating in. On the project, you know, making sure that people aren't sitting around with nothing to do. I think that's the biggest kind of detriment to a successful volunteer project, is people don't feel like their time was valued and that they really were able to accomplish what they set out to do. They're coming to work hard for you and on behalf of our public lands. So making sure that there's enough work, that there are people that are kind of circulating, and if somebody looks like they don't know what they're doing, getting them involved in an activity that will help the project out. And then thanking people all the time on the project, whether that's a one-on-one thank you, whether that's a group, you know, whether that's some shout outs during a meal time, but expressing that appreciation over and over and over again, authentically. You know, you definitely want to make sure that it doesn't sound like lip service, but you know, you know, people are out there working hard and they want to have a pat on the back. After the project, really important to send a thank you note. It doesn't have to be long. It can be an email. And again, listing out the accomplishments that were part of that project. You know, volunteers in the span of 2 days did X, Y, and Z work. Having a little testimonial or a little quote from maybe the land manager with additional thanks. And then the one that we tend to forget about, which is outside of any project, you know, you have a community. Whenever you're doing volunteer projects on the ground, even if you're only doing a handful a year, you have a community that is engaged with you and your work. So recognizing and thanking people outside of any project activity. We do an annual awards and appreciation event. Actually, ours is tonight, that celebrates the accomplishments from the project. We do a lot of shout outs to volunteers in our newsletters and on social media, but making sure that people know that we are there backing them up outside of any tool being put in the ground. And then the last piece I want to talk a little bit about on the next slide is retention. So we all know it's a lot easier to keep a customer than get a new one, right? So once you've had a volunteer come out with you, it's great to be able to keep them and keep them coming back. Now we know that volunteer stewardship is not for everybody, and there will be people who come out once and they go, oh, that was really hard, and you know, I hurt my back or whatever it may have been. But then there are others who catch the bug, and you know, there are some things that we can all do to make sure that they keep coming back our way. So one is making sure that they have a great experience that's safe, that they don't feel like, you know, they could lose a part of a limb on a project is really important. Again, I can't stress enough, having plenty of work to do and being organized, valuing people's time, understanding why they showed up, and then leveraging that reason, talking to them about their personal investment and you know, why they chose to be there. Once you have that information, if there's a way for you to keep it in a database and then use that in recruitment efforts, that goes a long way. So for example, if somebody tells you that, you know, they really love being in high alpine environments, then you have a list of those folks. And if you have a trouble filling a project, you can send an email that says, we've got this great opportunity. You told us that you love high alpine projects and we've got it next weekend. It just makes people feel like you were really paying attention to what they were saying. And then some of these other things I think are kind of self-explanatory. I want to make sure we leave some time for Q&A. So I will move on, and I think it's back to you, Dan.
It is. On that note, Ian, I was wondering if I could get a quick time check there, see how we're looking, about how much time we have left.
We have 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
There you go.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
top of the hour. Thank you.
Cool. So I'll just buzz through some of this real quick then. We were thinking we kind of offer some project examples to show how a few of these things have cropped up for us, and I'll try to do this real quickly. But specifically in how it's shown up in our wilderness efforts, really around diversifying our programming and our project efforts in ways that we think can kind of, one, open our impact to different resource areas via leveraging our strong partnerships, but also doing different things that are going to help us engage new and different volunteer audiences. And so, you know, a lot of what we do, and a lot of what I've kind of heard from this presentation, or excuse me, some of the stewardship examples so far, which there's a lot of trail maintenance in wilderness areas. And so we're certainly doing quite a bit of that. Maybe it's clearing trails with crosscuts, doing different types of maintenance, both light and more heavy and technical, all down to organizing, you know, really long backcountry hitches for small groups to go out and spend a lot of time in given wilderness areas. But what we learned over time is that, you know, this is really good work, but these are some of our highest barriers of entry types of projects. One, the level of certification volunteers have to have, the physical difficulty that might be involved, and down to these longer trips where, you know, the volunteers have to come with some experience and some gear that's going to preclude participation from others. And so in the last few years, we have looked at kind of working with our partners to develop different project types that we feel are kind of lowering the barrier for entry, and then potentially giving us more room for participation of other volunteers who might not be able to participate in some of these trail projects. So for instance, we've been doing a lot of monitoring and survey work in different areas. In the Rio Grande National Forest, we've put together some BioBlitz and wildlife and noxious weed monitoring projects where volunteers are coming out and gathering observations of data that are helping to inform wilderness management decisions around those resource areas. We've also done some volunteer water quality monitoring, collecting samples from alpine lakes that can also be done independently by volunteers. So kind of opens us up to both an audience that wants to do that, plus that's kind of an experience that some folks are interested in for their professional careers. So we've had a lot of success in recruiting from local colleges in the areas where we're doing that work with students that want to get that experience and go collect water quality samples. A really big effort here on the Front Range in the Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness that was, you know, identified for us by our partners in the agency and at the Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness was the need for doing dispersed campground surveys, identifying where those are they in, you know, meeting wilderness requirements, and or are they sustainable? And so by telling volunteers, bring your phone, download this survey app, get out there and collect this level of information, it's really simple. It's a much different type of project, and it's, again, a little bit lower of a barrier for entry. And but we're still meeting a priority need. And also during the pandemic, this was one where we were able to shift very quickly to allowing volunteers to just go out on their own and get it done, rather than trying to work in large groups when we kind of had that shut down for a long time. So with that example in particular, in the past 2 years, we've had 50 volunteers participating in that program, and they've surveyed over 320 dispersed campsites in the Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness. So it's been a pretty successful shift for us that was helpfully identified for us by our partners and in that area. And just another quick example that I'll throw out is we've been kind of expanding what we're doing with, or we're planning to expand what we're doing with noxious weed management in wilderness areas for a couple of different reasons. For a long time, we've had an annual project with the Arapahoe National Forest and the Indian Peaks Wilderness Alliance, in addition to some other partners, treating oxeye daisy at the entrance to the James Peak Wilderness area. And that's been a popular project. Again, it's close to town. It's really easy to participate in. It's been a great opportunity for engaging youth and families due to the nature of the work. And so we really have some proof of concept in that. And we were approached by our partners this year at the Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness area to see if we would be interested in helping them move the needle a little bit on noxious weed management in that area. And so with that kind of proof of concept in hand, we were pretty enthusiastic about that, both in providing some projects managed by VOC, but also in kind of co-managed projects where each group is providing a little bit of what's needed to make things go. And by that, I mean, Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek, you know, they have the local expertise, they have the knowledge of what's going on the ground, they have the volunteers in place that can help lead the work. We can help them by recruiting and providing volunteers and managing communication. So kind of co-managed projects between these two non-governmental organizations, both working for the same forest unit, is a concept that we're pretty excited about, that we think is going to help, you know, move the needle for that resource area and also be an opportunity to engage more in different types of volunteers. So with that all in mind, the last thing I want to talk about before we turn it over to Q&A, we've thrown a heck of a lot of information out at everybody today. There is a one-stop shop where you can go and get a lot of this information, and that's at our toolkit website, where free to download guides covering a lot of these topics, plus other resources are available. And so I'm going to quickly bounce over to that and kind of show folks what that looks like. Bear with me for just a moment. Anna, have I got the right thing up? Okay, cool. So this is at all one word, steppingupstewardship.org. And it's got a bunch of different program level, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, product management, selection, recruitment, risk and safety, you know, all sorts of different things. What I want to point out though, is that's a big collection of items that you can go and check out. There is a self-assessment button that leads you to a quick survey you can take, and then based on kind of what you put into the answers for these questions can kind of help point you to what resources on this website you might want to check out. So let me quickly throw these up on the screen again. So there's the links, and then during the Q&A, I will throw these into the chat. But just a couple of different things, you know, a bunch of different free to download guides at steppingupstewardship.org. If you go to steppingupstewardship.org/resources, there's a number of different things that we link to as well that might be helpful in both volunteer and nonprofit management, including the Colorado Outdoor Stewardship Coalition Best Practices Guide, which includes a lot more on partnership development and use of data. And then certainly want to invite folks to check out our Outdoor Stewardship Institute training program, which includes information about the curriculum that's available to use, including online courses that we've developed and provide in partnership with Colorado Mountain College here in Colorado. So with that, I'm going to take a deep breath and say I think we're ready for Q&A. So.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Anna. Really great work VOC is doing there in the state of Colorado. Thanks for all the work. Couple questions in the Q&A that I'll just throw out there for you both. And then if folks, we have about 10-15 minutes, but folks can also use the hand option if you'd like. And my fellow co-host Braden will unmute you so you can actually speak out loud. So the first question is, for the volunteers surveying dispersed campsites, what app do they use to collect the survey data?
Yeah, so it was a survey that was set up by the agency staff on ArcGIS, and then the app that is tied to that is Survey123. So what you have to do is kind of set up your system via ArcGIS, and I'd be happy to connect anyone with it's Ralph Brad at the Clear Creek Ranger District here in Colorado who set all this up, and he's definitely enthusiastic about collaboration. I can also, if it makes sense, I don't know, Randy or Ian, I can send you some of the information that can then be dispersed. But via the ArcGIS software, the mapping, the individual survey that the volunteers using, that's all set up, and then the volunteers access it via the Survey 123 app.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, just send that along to Randy and I, and we'll make sure that gets dispersed. A quick follow-up question that just popped up. Can that data be input offline?
Right, and absolutely. So what it does, it collects the data offline, and then it, what it beams it out once you're back in cell service or in online capability. So yes, it's all set up to be done offline.
All right, awesome. And Braden just posted an ArcGIS link in there as well. The other question here is, how do you go about training for noxious weeds? Local agency partners somewhat hesitant to give the okay for volunteers to help with that. Love to give some examples of how other programs train for their noxious weed work.
Right, it just depends what you're doing. I mean, one way to look at it is there mechanical removal that you can do with hand tools that really doesn't require a lot of training. Pulling them up by the roots, clipping weed heads. If that's useful to you, then that requires a very limited amount of training. The other area that we've gone into quite a bit is via our chainsaw training, woody species, specifically for us here in Colorado, Russian olive and salt cedars or tamarisk are big high priority species. So we've done the legwork to get the approval and the training in place for chainsaw volunteers, and that's all about communicating effectively with our agency partners and getting them to kind of buy into the fact that that level of training can help move that needle. The other example I can give, and I know that the Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek Wilderness, and certainly they're probably not limited to them, but they've had those same conversations, is that they are certifying, I think, for spraying, either by getting seasonal staff on board and or certifying volunteers. I think that's some of where the hesitancy is. It's not something that we train or do, but for my money, there's no reason volunteers couldn't be trained and certified for chemical application. Certainly in Colorado, that training, in Colorado at least, that training is widely available through some work that Colorado State does. So anyone can really access it. And it's just about having those conversations with your partners to kind of say, look, this is what we can do. And I don't think there's any reason to be hesitant if you can provide the appropriate training.
Great, thanks. Not seeing any other questions in our Q&A box, but folks can feel free to raise hands if you want to come off mute. Give folks just a minute to think about that. I'm not seeing any raised hands on my end. You're not either, Braden, are you?
No, I'm not seeing any raised hands.
All right, just making sure. I think that's about it as far as Q&As, unless someone else pipes up here in the next few minutes. But any last thoughts for us, Anna or Dan? Thanks again for a great presentation.
I would just say we're available if you have questions, if you want to take the self-assessment and then reach out to us. We do a little bit of kind of what we affectionately call custom assistance. So we're happy to talk with you and see if we can help with some of the resources that we put together.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're finishing up about 5 minutes early, Randy.
All right, well, great presentation, great organization, doing a lot of great things. I may have missed it, but I did have a question for both Anna and Dan as to how they would compare themselves to the White Mountain Collective in terms of how much they spend their time working with other organizations, helping them prepare and organize work versus doing their own standalone volunteer projects.
It's a good question. I don't have enough information to compare ourselves directly to that organization, but just from, I think, where we would say we're at, we're probably, Anna, I would think 75% kind of doing our own projects, and then 25 external capacity building work. And a lot of that is really around delivery of training. So that's the major kind of external capacity building work that we do is in training. But again, with groups like Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek as an example, part of the partnership we're trying to drive is with them as I've given, but certainly groups all over the place. It's not like VOC is going to come in and say, here's what we think needs to be done. It's that open partnership dialogue across all of our programs to say, well, okay, what's the priority? What's the need? And where's the best way for volunteers to plug in? And then from our perspective, how can we best offer our programs to help you move the needle and achieve something in your area? Because we operate statewide, so we don't really have a local area of focus. So that's kind of the flexibility we can offer.
And Dan, I'll put in a plug for you on that, because I've been talking to Mount Evans and Lost Creek on other issues. They're very appreciative, very enthusiastic about what you're doing, and they love the cooperative feeling of it. They also said those guys are a machine for generating volunteers. And then they have to work with them.
Right, and that's the gap that we're looking at, at least, in the last conversation we've had with them is, hey, you guys have the expertise to get this work done. How about we work on, some co-recruitment with you, and we can get you the volunteers on the ground, that sort of thing. So.
Well, lots of nice kudos and thanks coming into the chat there, including from Ann Baker Easley. But I have one last question that came up early. Dan, somebody was asking if that's the Island Lakes in your background.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in the past couple of years on the Island Lakes Trail, and then I actually got out there on my own personal backpacking trip this past summer. So just if you get the opportunity to visit the Flat Tops Wilderness in Colorado, I'd say it's a lifetime experience. It's a pretty amazing area, very rugged, very remote, and yeah, couldn't recommend it more.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you both.
All right, well, wonderful. Thanks for a great presentation, and thanks for all the resources that you provide to the stewardship community. I know that we're hoping to tap into those ourselves and share them with the broader wilderness stewardship community. If you've learned one thing through the week, is that there are many different models for how wilderness stewardship organizations, trail organizations are structured and organized. And so there's a lot that we can learn from each other out there in the wilderness community. Well, we will take a quick break, and we will be back in about 15 minutes at 4:15, and we'll start our last presentation of the day with Nathan Rigner talking about indigenous wilderness practices, how Native Americans and others have been stewarding the land for time after time immemorial. So come on back in another 15 minutes, and we'll have another great presentation for you. See you all soon.